Okay, as we start to get ready for panel 3, we have 3 papers on this panel. Dan Alexander and Asya Magazinnik, Inference about the Electoral Causes of Polarization. Hongman Park from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, Partisan Manipulation of Dimensionality and Party Polarization in the U.S. Congress. And then finally, Boris Shor, University of Houston, and Nolan McCarty from Princeton, 2 decades of polarization in American state legislatures. And 2 discussants, Anthony Fowler from the University of Chicago and Kris Kanthak from the University of Pittsburgh. So why don't we start with the first paper, Dan and Asya, Inference about Electoral Causes of Polarization.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'll present, and then we'll both take questions later. So this is something we've both been thinking about since early grad school in some iteration or another. So hope the result is something useful. So here we go. So if you're trying to theorize about the underlying causes of polarization, generally there are 2 classes of theories available to you, right? There are kind of top-down theories that take as a starting point parties and elites operating on the national stage, and they induce representatives to be more extreme in their voting and position taking. By contrast, there are kind of these bottom-up theories in which politicians are electorally responsive to a polarized electorate. Right, and these 2 classes of theories have different normative implications. They say very different things about the kind of the health of American democracy, right? They suggest different prescriptions. But we're going to focus today on bottom-up theories, not because we think they're right, but because we think to the extent that we want to entertain them at all, we have to think somewhat carefully and rigorously about what it would take for them to make sense, right? And it turns out that this is not so straightforward. What do we mean for a bottom-up theory to make sense? Well, it has to hold water logically. That seems like a rather low bar, right? But we argue that the particular institutional context that we're forced to operate in here poses some distinct challenges. So here's an example of a picture one sees a lot. Here we have kind of national level co-trends of a measure of income inequality in purple, the income share of the top 1%. And in red and green, the polarization of the House and the Senate, respectively. And we see this pretty compelling co-trend here, right? And that might naturally lead us to posit a causal relationship between national inequality and polarization in Congress, right? But let's interrogate the mechanism that would have to underlie such a relationship, right? So here's the distribution of household income in the US. And loosely, we might have in mind some theory about how those on the low end are electing pro-redistribution candidates, and those on the high end are electing candidates that favor small government, low taxes, and we get this kind of polarized Congress, right? The Achilles heel of any such explanation is that it ignores the structure of representation in this context, right? So each state elects a senator, right? Or so in order to make any logical sense, the theory that I sketched has to be driven by a cross-state income inequality, right? Where these poorer states in the white or light gray are electing left candidates. The richer states in the dark green are electing right candidates, and that maps onto some kind of partisan divide. Right, so that's what we mean by a theory holding water logically. It has to account for the structure of American electoral institutions, and thus it likely will focus on a cross-constituency rather than within constituency inequality. Right, our second standard is that it has to hold up empirically, right? So the comparative statics of the theory are consistent with the data. So returning to this picture, right, if we see over time that our Congress has polarized, it should be the relatively poor states that have moved to the left, or the states that have gotten poorer, and the states that are getting richer moving to the right, if the theory that I sketched out is correct. Right, so now that I've made clear our kind of broad standard for assessing theories, what kind of theories are we thinking about here? So we're going to focus on theories linking income inequality to legislative polarization. And we're going to draw these theories from the very rich political economy literature that studies how economic conditions on the ground translate into the ideology of legislators via the electoral process. Meltzer and Richard is perhaps the most famous and familiar of these models, but there's a number to choose from. People have thought a great deal about this. But because these theories weren't built for the particular problem of studying legislative polarization in the United States, they're more general. We need to adapt and extend these theories in two ways. So we need to, as I've already mentioned, we need to adapt them to the American institutional context to be consistent with single member district elections for the House, 2 for the Senate. We need to think about how a two-party system will factor in. And then we also need to extend them from predictions about ideology to predictions about polarization, right? These theories tend to yield predictions about ideology, and we have to extend them one step further to say something about a transformation or a function of ideology, which is polarization. So let me sketch out kind of an example using the very familiar Meltzer-Richard model. So very briefly, the original theory has voters kind of directly electing redistributive policy through a tax plan via a representative kind of through the electoral process. The median voter is decisive there. And the key comparative static that Meltzer-Richard gives us is that we get more redistribution as the median voter's income relative to the national mean income rises. Right, so let's say we want to extend this theory and ask if it explains observed polarization. Right, so the first thing we have to do is incorporate what we consider the fundamental assumption of single member districts, right? So imagine that kind of a Meltzer-Richard model is playing out in each of 50 states or each of 435 congressional districts to construct a legislature, right? We have to adapt it to use the median voter in the district. In the numerator, we still want the national mean in the denominator because policy is decided at the national level, right? So we argue that that's kind of a fundamental assumption that you have to contend with. And then there are a lot of flexible assumptions in addition, right? So for example, how constrained is candidate entry? What is the mapping from ideology to partisanship? Who is the decisive voter, right? It might not be the median in the US context, it might be higher because of differential turnout. What information does the decisive voter use, right? So here we want to make the distinction where the analyst is constrained to make the right assumptions about the institutional structure, right? But the voter in our model might have, we might allow for the voter in our model to have certain kind of shortcuts, right? For example, for the national mean, the decisive voter might either be very well-informed and very rational and actually use the national mean, or they might use the kind of local conditions as a proxy, right? And we can allow for that. But then kind of having nested our electoral theories within this institutional structure, having brought in these flexible assumptions, we can then generate some predictions about polarization, right? And we take two approaches to doing that in the paper. The first is a modeling approach, right? So one idea we had, and this was the first idea, was to work this out analytically, right? This might be why it took us so long to write this paper, because we had many false starts. And I think the place we got to really illustrates the difficulty of working out firm predictions about polarization analytically. We kind of we want to write down our process for posterity in case it's useful for others to learn. But I think ultimately we conclude that this is not the way forward because it requires some very specific assumptions about the joint distribution of the exogenous variable income in our case, across districts and the changes in that variable across districts, as well as some assumptions about the magnitude of the change in equilibrium legislator ideology as a function of a change in income, right? These are not things that are intuitive for us to reason about or that are easy for us to make assumptions about. And these are precisely the sorts of assumptions that we seek to shed in writing elegant models. Right, so another way forward is an empirical approach, right? And we say, well, the performance of a theory is ultimately an empirical question anyway. So we want to propose instead a protocol for empirically testing theories of polarization. And so here's how that goes, right? So we think that the first step for the analyst remains a causal evaluation of the proposed electoral mechanism, right? So let's take again Meltzer-Richard, and let's call W, KT, some conditions on the ground in district K at time T, and XKT, the ideology of legislator K in district K at time T. So in this case, W is going to be the median income or the median income over national mean. And X is going to be legislator ideology. We're also going to roll into a variable Z, kind of a vector of controls, fixed effects. You can even think kind of instrumental variables, anything that you need to causally identify that relationship between W and X. Again, this is a kind of first stage test of whether your electoral model has any empirical validity in the data. This is before we even think about polarization, right? And so it is really important, we kind of talk about this in the paper, it is really important to get the causal test right. It ends up being kind of difficult, but we'll maybe if there's time in the end, I'll talk about some of the trade-offs. But if the effect is there, is substantively and statistically significant in this kind of stage 0, then the analyst can proceed to these next steps. So we suggest as kind of step 1 of this process, running a baseline model. So regressing X, that's ideology, on Z, our kind of vector of whatever you need for causal identification. So we're gonna use in our example, we're gonna look at the Senate and we're gonna use state, time, and party fixed effects. So crucially, we're omitting the W, which is the kind of theoretical variable of interest that we care about. We're going to generate the predicted values. We're going to calculate polarization or predicted polarization based on those predicted values for ideology. And we're going to compute the root mean squared error between those and observed polarization, right? So this is kind of giving you a sense of how well a null model essentially performs without the variable of interest. We're going to repeat the same thing with the variable of interest. So putting in W, generating the predicted values, generating predicted polarization, and computing the root mean squared error with observed polarization. And then kind of to assess how useful the theory is, we want to construct a null distribution. This is kind of our way of getting some sense of uncertainty. Right, so we're going to randomly permute the vector W, so income, in this case, by district. In each iteration, we're going to estimate the model with the permuted W in there. We're going to get predicted polarization, compute root mean squared error with observed polarization, and that's going to give us a nice distribution that we can compare to the true W in the model. Right, so let's apply this approach to Meltzer-Richard real quick. So here we have kind of step 0. This is where we're checking to see whether this kind of first stage theory even holds, or kind of 0 state, whether the electoral mechanism itself, right, the effect of income on ideology holds. So we look over time at data from the Senate from 1984 to 2018. And in fact, we estimate this fairly robust relationship which goes in the predicted direction, which leads us to kind of move forward with the rest of the test. So the next question is, does it actually? So there's some evidence for the electoral theory, but does that electoral theory actually help us explain polarization? And there it does not, right? So here is our permutation test in gray. That's our null distribution. The black line is the mean of that distribution. And then the red line for comparison is the model omitting the variable of interest W, income. And in green is when we include income, right? So it's really doing nothing over this null model. It's really not taking us any further in explaining observed polarization over time. Let's see, I have a few minutes, so I'll show you. So we kind of run this several times with several interesting models that we could find from the political economy literature. The one that performs best, interestingly enough, is this model from Dimmick et al., which basically posits that people have direct utility where people dislike inequality, right? So it's kind of building on the Meltzer-Richard intuition. People, all else equal, would like less redistribution. However, they have disutility from inequality. And because of the way the utility functions are set up here, the rich are more sensitive to this than the poor, because this is kind of a model of altruism. The rich get more utility from giving some of their money away to combat inequality than to enjoy it themselves, right? And this is the model that performs the best. So this is the green line. We don't really commit to something like a 95% confidence interval here, but this is clearly doing much better than the null distribution at explaining observed polarization. So, do we conclude that polarization is driven by the altruism of the rich? Of course not. We, however, think that this kind of suggests an iterative process for theory testing, right? So that was a model that performed very well, right? So we kind of go back, think about what other models might be consistent with those results, propose those models, go back to our kind of theory testing framework, and kind of iterate until we get somewhere good, right? So we hope that we hope that the contribution is really kind of a useful framework for others to kind of think about these theories. And that's all. I look forward to your comments.
Thanks very much. The second paper is Hongman Park from University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee.
Hi, thank you very much, Jeff, for inviting me to this conference. Today I'm going to present my theory on the partisan manipulation of dimensionality and its consequences on party polarization in the US Congress. So we have a very interesting pattern in polarization in the US Congress, which is that the party polarization, the level of party polarization and the low dimensionality actually goes together over time. And we also find that when we have a stronger party, we tend to observe the lower dimensionality in the US Congress. And what I want to do today is to try to untangle the underlying logics behind this pattern. And in doing so, I want to focus on party leaders, especially the majority party leaders, and their strategic decisions. And I want to combine two prominent theories. One is the Bill Riker's concept of heuristics, and the another is the Cox and McCubbin's partisanism that control theory. So I'm going to present my theory on the partisan manipulation of dimensionality. First of all, let me explain how it actually works. So according to Riker, we need to structure the world if we want to win the game. In other words, we need to introduce a new but salient dimension in order to upset the current equilibrium. Let me give you one example. Let's say on the left, we have a bill coming out of the standing committees, and it is probably the median result on the dimension of that committee. Let's say it's Agriculture Committee. And this is the committee recommendation based on the agriculture dimension. However, when it goes to the amending stage on the floor, the majority leader and party leaders could allow several amendments here in this case, Amendment 1, Amendment 2, Amendment 3, not with respect to the agriculture dimension, but with respect to different dimension. Let's say it's a economic liberal conservative dimension. Then we have 1, 2, 3, 4 options on the table. And in terms of agricultural dimension, these 4 options are exactly same, but in terms of economic liberal conservative dimension, these 4 options are slightly different among others. Then among these 4 options, probably the median result will come out. And the Amendment 3 will be the final outcome. Then we analyze, as a political scientist, we analyze these with respect to roll call voting record. And then we only see 4 possible outcomes, 4 possible options from the voting record. And it looks like it's just a liberal conservative dimension. Even though there was a agriculture dimension, but we are not actually able to see the agriculture dimension when we analyze the voting record. So what it suggests is that if the majority party and then the majority party leaders would like to see the liberal conservative dimension prevail on the floor, then they would utilize the restrictive rules, both in the House and the Senate, and so that it can set the condition for debate and amending activities for individual legislation. And I want to focus on the special role in the House of Representatives, because the special role is completely controlled by the majority party and then the speaker. And in the Senate, I want to focus on a complex unanimous consent agreement. It is generally known that the majority party leadership has a pretty good control over this complex unanimous consent agreement. And these rules actually allows the party leaders to set up these kind of array of amendments so that the floor politics could look like liberal conservative dimension, not the agriculture dimension. I mean, it's just an example. It could be other dimensions, such as civil rights dimension here in this dimension, or some other dimensions. What I want to say is that the majority party, when the majority party thinks that this bill is important, then the majority party would utilize the restrictive rules that makes the bill, all the options of the bills look liberal or conservative. Then the reason is why? Why do the party leaders want this kind of manipulation of dimensionality? My argument is that it could be good for agenda control. First, it could be good for the positive agenda control because it could help building easy floor coalitions, because liberal conservative dimension is the default clavish in the US Congress over time. And it also creates a very clear party image or very clear partisan brand name, because it is a very ready-made distinction. Another thing is that this kind of manipulation actually helps the negative agenda control, because it could avoid unexpected ugly defeats on the floor. And when the majority party leader and then party leaders in general set up the arrangement for this kind of amending process, they could make sure that the liberal conservative dimension dominates and everybody follows that dimension and everybody will focus on that issue. and all the politics on the floor, especially during the local voting stage, will be dominated by the liberal conservative dimension. And there will not be a unexpected dimension coming out and then upset the current equilibrium. And the consequence of this is that through this agenda control mechanism by the majority party and then party leaders in general, the multidimensional policy space in Congress could transform into unidimensional policy space, because party leaders would like to see liberal conservative dimension more often, and more frequent appearance of the liberal conservative dimension on the floor could make the unidimensional policy space dominate from the voting record. And it could look more polarized, because unidimensional arrangement would naturally divide the party lines, and it could create more party dividing votes over time, and people will see more polarized Congress over time. So my hypothesis has two things. First, for the House, when restrictive special rule is utilized for a given piece of legislation in the House, the local voting record on the floor is more likely to be associated with the liberal conservative dimension than with other dimensions. And in the Senate, when restrictive unanimous consent agreement is utilized for a given piece of legislation, then the local voting on the floor, same as in the House, is more likely to be associated with the liberal conservative dimension than with other dimensions. So I gathered the data from 1947 to 1994. It's 23 Congresses. It's mainly the Democratic majority. And I focus on all the major legislation. The list came from the Clinton and the Pinsky list. And I went into the voting record, and I tried to gather all the voting record that has any floor final passage vote. And my N is 186. And for each bill, I went into the final passage vote, and I calculate the PRE improvement from the first dimensional DW nominate model to the second dimensional DW nominate model. And that improvement indicates the importance of the second dimension as relative to the first dimension. So the smaller value of PRE2 minus PRE1 could mean a more unidimensional policy space. And I'm going to use that as a dependent variable. And because this dependent variable is somewhat continuous, I'm going to utilize the simple linear regression through OLS. I estimated with and without fixed effects model, and the results are pretty much the same. For the independent variables, the key independent variable is the contents of the rules. And for the House, for example, I want to use open versus modified close versus close rule. And I also utilize very detailed reading of the special rule. And I have quoted all these different sorts of detailed contents, but my focus is the certain amendment only contents. And for the Senate, I categorized 5 different categories of the complex unanimous consent agreement. And I would like to see the restrictive unanimous consent agreement had an impact on the dimensional structure on the bill. And I also did the reading of the individual unanimous consent agreement, and I coded based on all different sorts of detailed contents. And limited amending activity is the category that I would like to focus on. And for the control variables, I included several different variables, such as the contents, issue contents of the legislation, agriculture, the civil rights, and etc. And I also utilize the Congress number in order to utilize the time trend. And I also utilize the complexity of the legislation by looking at the number of bills associated with the final passage vote, and also utilize the number of standing committees that were involved in that specific legislation. So here is the result for the House. So the first model is only for the special rule. Second model that includes the control variables. Basically, what it says is that when the special rule is modified closed as compared to open rule, it is more likely to be liberal conservative. And if we look at the specific detailed contents of the special rule, then it's also positive. So if we have a special rule that has a certain amendment only clause provision, then it is more likely that it will be the liberal conservative issue, the legislation. This is the result from the Senate. As I told you, I look at the unanimous consent agreement, and my focus is on the restrictive unanimous consent agreement. And when there is a restrictive unanimous consent agreement as compared to no unanimous consent agreement, this positive coefficient means that it is more likely, the legislation is more likely to be liberal conservative. And if we look at the detailed contents, it's basically same. When the unanimous consent agreement has some restriction on the amending activities, it is more likely to be dominated by the liberal conservative dimension. So basically, when the individual legislation receives restrictive rules through the special rule in the House or the complex unanimous consent agreement in the Senate, and this individual legislation is more likely to be dominated by the liberal conservative dimension on the final passage voting stage. So I look at the role of restrictive rules on the low dimensional structure, and the entire argument of my partisan theory of the dimensionality is that this low dimensional structure actually creates the party dividing votes more often, and it inflates the party polarization. And the restrictive rule has to be motivated by the partisanly minded leadership. And I also, in the paper, I also included these two types of auxiliary hypothesis and the testing of auxiliary hypothesis. And if you are curious about it, I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A session. Basically, what I showed you today is a theory on the partisan manipulation of dimensionality. I argued that when the party considers certain legislation to be important, it will create a restrictive rule and given to the floor so that the liberal conservative dimension dominates on the floor during the final passage voting stage. And the reason why the party leadership does this is that it helps the partisan agenda control. It helps building easy floor coalitions. It helps creating clear partisan branding, and it helps avoiding unexpected ugly defeat on the floor. And the consequence of this whole process is that it is more likely to for us to observe a very highly inflated party polarization in the U.S. Congress. And I read the contents of the individual special rule and a complex unanimous consent agreement for individual major legislation, and I found a strong evidence for my partisan manipulation theory. This is all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hongman. Last paper is by Boris Shor and Nolan McCarty, 2 decades of polarization in American state legislatures.
All right, so this is joint with Nolan McCarty, and this is a project that we've been working on quite a while, but I wanted to zoom back a little bit and just give a little bit more of an origin story. So I learned how to program, and that's what got me into this current career, probably by buying magazines at a newsstand and literally typing them into my Commodore 64 that I got when I was 8 years old, thanks to my grandfather, who had just immigrated and kind of pushed my parents to buy me a Commodore. And then as a high school student, I got a Commodore Amiga, and I wrote a recipe manager in high school. And then when I got to school as an undergrad, I showed my code, the source code for this recipe manager, to Howard Rosenthal, and then he thought it was fine as I flipped through the printout of the code, and he hired me to write Vote for Windows. And as I'm working on this project, I start realizing what I'm doing. I'm not just a programmer. I'm like, wait, you have data going back to the 1780s, and what a single dimension explains this much? What in the world is going on? So naturally, the idea comes up. What could we do the same thing for state legislatures? Yes, except the data is a lot more challenging to get. So Nolan and I have been working on this project since the mid 2000s, and we published a paper together in 2011 that had the full series for all 50 states with lots of missing data for the 1996 to 2009 period. And since that time, we retooled our processes and got more professional, tried to become more professional, introduced a revision control system, got a professional programmer in charge of the data project, devised unique identifiers to disentangle the data. Today, I'm going to be showing results that are allow us to take stock of this additional decade of work. So we have a lot more data to show. 61% more unique legislators over this time period, nearly double the number of chamber years of aggregate data. And today I'm going to be talking about some of the new findings on polarization that we can see now, with the benefit of being able to see those 20 years with all the missing data, or almost all of the missing data filled in. So polarization has been ongoing since actually even the late 70s, and polarization in state legislatures has only accelerated in the past decade. And both parties appear to be polarizing, but at different speeds in different states. And the interesting thing, as opposed to Congress, it looks like it's Democrats have been leading the charge, at least more recently, in terms of polarizing faster in more states than Republicans, although there's just a lot of heterogeneity. And finally, I'm going to talk about the connection between opinion and legislative polarization, which appears to be stronger in the more recent time period of the 2010s as opposed to earlier. So the basics, I'm just going to fly through. We're using roll call data to estimate state-specific ideal points for each legislator in a single left-right dimension, although we potentially could do more than one dimension. And then we use Project VoteSmart NPAT candidate surveys to allow us to estimate a common space across the country for the legislative candidates who respond to the survey. And then in each state, we map those roll call based ideal points from step one into NPAT space for all legislators, including non-responders, and we aggregate up as needed. So this is what it looks like from all Democrats and all Republicans in all states from 96 to 2020, and you could very clearly see the separation between the two parties and the overlap in the mid 90s, and the separation in later years. And you can also see this the median for the Democrats moving left faster than the median for Republicans over time. Let's zoom in on 1996 and 2020, and you could see how much overlap there was. And this is there was overlap within states, but most of this overlap is across states. And there's plenty of Democrats who are more conservative than Republicans, and plenty of Republicans who are more liberal than Democrats. And now much of that overlap, not all of it, has gone away, and essentially there's no more within state overlap, but there is still some a little bit of cross state overlap. And now zooming in on all 50 states, so this is going to be a constant challenge in this talk about presenting visualizations for all 50 states, but we have all 50 states here divided up into regions, and what you'll just notice, you can just tell, is how separated they are within each state, but how some states do stick out still for being relatively depolarized, and those are states like Rhode Island and Hawaii. But the norm is a separation between the states. But you'll also see that in some states, both parties are tilted to the left, or some states both parties are tilted to the right. There's just a lot of heterogeneity here. And this is the distribution of individual legislator ideal points. So now we're going to aggregate up, and we're going to measure polarization as typically done as the distance between party medians in a given chamber year. And other measures are highly correlated with this one. So distance between means instead of medians, average pairwise distance between legislators, standard deviation of ideal points. Now, again, challenge displaying all 50 states, but what I'm trying to do is at every slide, try to be explicit about which level I'm talking about. Okay, so the trend is increasing. So this is this is the polarization of parties within each chamber, the distance between the Democrats and Republicans, and it's been increasing over time. And one other thing that this shows is for more of the time period, the upper chambers have been less polarized than the lower chambers, which is not something necessarily we see in Congress, but that seems to have gone away as of the mid-2010s. Breaking things down by region, we see big variation in levels, but also variation in trends as well. So the western states, which is this purple line, has always been more polarized than all the other regions, and the South in the beginning of the time period was the least polarized region, and now has rapidly polarized. But the West was the most polarized and hasn't kept up a rapid pace of polarization, whereas the Northeast was somewhat not very polarized and has polarized over time, but not nearly as much. So now let's drop down to the individual state level, and you'll see that this is now states averaging states over time, and we'll see that there's states that are consistently more polarized than the average. These are states like California, Colorado, Washington, Arizona, Texas. And at the bottom, the least polarized states like Rhode Island, Louisiana, Arkansas, Nebraska, Delaware. But this is a average over the time period, and the trends are very different. So this average obscures quite a bit. So what I'm showing here is a histogram of the state trends over time for all of the 99 chambers. And you could see, and this is a 0, would be not polarizing. And most of the states are to the right of 0, meaning that they're polarizing, but there's just a lot of variation in the speed of that polarization. But you'll also notice there are some states that are actually not polarizing or even potentially depolarizing over that time. It's the minority, definitely the minority of them, for sure. So I'm just going to take one region to zoom into individual states, and you can just see how much variation there is. So this is a plot of states from 96 to 2020. And if you see California here was the most polarized over time, and now is the second most polarized because it was overtaken by Colorado, which is just polarizing extremely rapidly over this time period, even though it started off in the mid 90s, sort of in the middle of the pack. And then you'll see Hawaii here, just not really doing very much, not very polarized and not polarizing over time either. Utah, for Jeremy, is kind of moderately polarized in the beginning of the time period and has increased moderately since then. And if you look at the dividing between Democrats on the left and Republicans on the right, what you'll see is a story in Colorado where Colorado Democrats are polarizing, moving to the left very, very quickly, and Republicans in Colorado also moving. But in California, it's the Democratic Party that's moving to the left and being more responsible for the polarization trend in California than the California Republicans. And then Hawaii, in Hawaii, Republicans are just not going anywhere. So one thing that we've been able to do is really plumb the archives for historical data, and that's something that we haven't yet shown, which is we have archives going back in some places to the 50s, but here I'm showing it just from the late 70s on. And for a minority of these states, you could just see that the time trend for polarization has been going on for quite a long time. And Texas and Georgia are very clear examples of states that were formerly not very polarized on the liberal conservative dimension, now moving to high levels of polarization. Texas, one of the very, very highest levels of polarization. And Hawaii's depolarization, something that's been going on for quite a long time. Oops, sorry. And now this is a bunch of other states where we have slightly less data, now going back to the mid 80s. The one thing I wanted to point out here was Nebraska, right? So it was a paradigmatic example of a depolarized state, but that sort of misses this extremely rapid polarization that's happened recently. And it's interesting, of course, because Nebraska is a nominally non-party legislature, right? So it's not supposed to be nonpartisan legislature, where when you're on the ballot, there's no party labels. So what about asymmetric polarization? So in Congress, the nominate measures of congressional polarization say that Republicans have been disproportionately responsible for the party divide in the past couple of decades, a decade or two. And what about this? What about the states? So, averaging things out nationally, you'll see that both parties have been polarizing, but Democrats especially have been doing so. So these are the vertical axis is the average of the party medians, where higher values are more conservative, lower values are more liberal here. And both parties are going to the extremes. So this is the same data presented as changes. And obviously there's a lot of bouncing around because of the periodicity of the elections, and some states have even year elections. So I added here a lowest curve to smooth that out. And what you can see is that beginning in 2010, the parties really accelerated polarization. And for Republicans, that polarization trend has decelerated, but not gone to zero. Whereas with Democrats, that polarization trend appears to have increased and not decelerated. In terms of regions, Democrats in the South, especially since 2010, really have taken a turn to the left, which makes sense if you think about what's happening across the South, which is just wipeouts of moderate Democrats and being replaced by conservative Republicans. So in Texas, Democrats are disproportionately drawn from cities like Houston and are quite liberal. And for Republicans, you can see there's just a really stark divide here between the Northeast in red and the other three regions. That's consistently more liberal. Getting a little bit more polarized later at the end, but not very much. But whereas for Democrats, it's the region of the country where Democrats have become the most progressive is the West Coast, now taking over from the Northeast. So if you subtract those party trends, those longitudinal trends for Democrats and for Republicans within each chamber or state over time, if there's no difference between the two parties, we're going to get 0 on this histogram. And bars to the right are areas where are states or chambers where Republicans are going polarizing faster than Democrats, and to the left where Democrats are polarizing faster than the Republicans. And you can just clearly see there's just more mass to the left of 0 than there is to the right of 0, indicating that in more states and in large quantities, Democrats are polarizing more faster. One other aspect of this polarization is that states are becoming increasingly different over time. So if we look at just the legislative medians, just taking the medians of the states and taking the standard deviation of those medians over time, it's just been increasing. Almost always. There's some changes a little bit here and there, but so what that implies is that, well, states are more ideologically heterogeneous, and that sort of might help us explain why we see so much policy divergence over states in the states over time. States look very different from each other, more so now than ever. In 2018, Nolan, myself, and Jonathan Rodden, and Chris Osanovich and Chris Warshaw wrote a paper about investigating the connection between opinion and legislative polarization. And there in that paper, we combined our state legislative ideology data with the Osanovich and Warshaw opinion data on opinion within districts and across districts. And we tested it on the data on the 2000s district. And what we found there was that across districts sorting, there appeared to be sorting happening, which is to say that there was the more variation there was across districts and opinion polarization, there was also more legislative polarization. But we found an even stronger result for within district polarization. Districts that were more polarized within states, within districts, elected more extreme representatives. And so in this paper, we replicate that paper, but with data from Osanovich and Warshaw on districts in the 2010s, which is not public, but something that Chris Warshaw was kind enough to generate for us and give to us. And so this is just summarizing the results. So on the columns are the era. So this is the 23 to 2012 districts. This is now for the lower chamber. On the top is the lower chamber. The bottom is the upper chamber. And then the right column is the 2010s districts, the 2013 to 2020 data, lower chamber, upper chamber. And you'll see this is for connecting opinion heterogeneity across districts, so investigating the sorting story. And you can see that there's a stronger relationship in the 2010s between opinion divergence across districts and legislative polarization, both for the lower chamber and for the upper chamber. Now, for the divergence story, we only have data for the upper chamber districts, but similarly, in the left column is the 2003 to 2012 districts, 2013 to 2020 districts on the right-hand column. And you'll see a stronger relationship in the 2010s than we did in the 2000s between opinion divergence within districts and legislative polarization, in the states. So where do we go from here? Right. So we want to, this archival work is extremely laborious and time consuming, and we want to collaborate with others to extend that roll call data backwards for more states and continue doing going forward in time, of course. And we've been developing a kind of a Rosetta Stone of unique identifiers to facilitate by legislator, but potentially by bill, to facilitate merging with other state legislative data sets. And we want to create this, if we can find the funding for it, but have a better infrastructure for kind of this collaboration and sharing. And with that, I will stop. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Boris. So we had 3 papers, and I lined up 2 discussants today. Anthony Fowler from the University of Chicago and Kris Kanthak from the University of Pittsburgh. And I asked them to figure out how to distribute the labor. So they will let me know what they think.
All right, it's good to talk to everyone. I wish we were all in Southern California together, but I hope we'll do that another time soon. It's good to see lots of friendly faces. These are all really interesting papers. I'm going to talk just about Dan and Asya's paper and Boris and Nolan's paper, and then Kris is going to focus more on Hongman's paper and maybe a little bit else. But let me start by talking about the Asya Magazinnik paper, which I think is really interesting. So I'll give you my very high level overview of this, which is that we have all these theoretical models, and we have lots of empirical estimates that are related to the extent to which different factors influence representation, influence elections, and so forth. But we don't have a lot of models where we're thinking about 435 of those games being played simultaneously, and then those 435 representatives all get together in a legislature, work things out, right? That would be a total mess of a model. And so to what extent, I think their point is, what can theorists say and what can empiricists who are working on within these kinds of models say about polarization, which is really about what's happening across all the districts and so forth, right? Typically, we think about polarization as being differences between the 2 major parties when we're talking about polarization in the US. And so most of the models that we have don't really speak to polarization per se. And so how can we do that in a better job? They have, they discuss the tricky issues in doing that. They have some really interesting proposals for doing that. And I think proposals are really interesting, but I think in some ways, this is a really thorny problem. And I want to talk about some of the thorniness involved in that problem. So if you really believe in the Meltzer-Richard kind of model that they talked about, then there should be something that we should be able to measure, something like the state median minus the national mean that correlates very strongly with what kinds of representation a particular state or district is getting, right? And so you might think there should be some increasing relationship here between, say, your senator's nominate score and this particular factor, right? The Senate median minus the national mean. Doesn't have to be that, but we might have a model where we think there's something here that should matter, and certain kinds of states should be getting more conservative or more liberal representation. So we have a model like that. What can we say about polarization here when polarization is about differences in party means inside the legislature? Well, you might say, well, let's imagine that we have 2 states. One of them has a Democratic representative, and they're way over here on the left with the blue, where the blue dot is. One of them has a Republican representative, they're over there on the right. And here you can see there's some polarization. Obviously, the Republican is more conservative than Democrat. And so to the extent that we care about polarization per se, we can see that in the difference, the vertical distance between those 2 dots, right? This starts to get really complicated now. If I want to take my model here, I've got my very simple Meltzer-Richard kind of model with, in this case, I'm drawing a line here. If I, if this, so I can ask, okay, what are some things that could happen in the world that could cause polarization to change? Suppose something about inequality changes where this factor on this horizontal variable just increases for everybody, right? We would get a shift up in all of the states or all of the districts, but we wouldn't expect to see a change in polarization, right? Or alternatively, we could get a shift down. If all the states are shifting down, again, we might get a shift down, but we wouldn't see any kind of net effect on polarization. The difference between the parties is going to stay the same. But of course, if there was some kind of polarizing effect, if it was the case that in some state, in the states that already had high inequality, they started getting more, and the states that had low inequality, they started getting less, we might expect theoretically that's when we would expect to see an increase in polarization. So it's useful to think through that, and the paper already thinks through some of these thorny issues. But this is going to start to get even more complicated if we start wondering whether or not we really have the right functional form here. So for example, suppose that this Meltzer-Richard factor really matters a lot, but suppose it matters in some kind of nonlinear way. So here I've drawn a picture where this thing is just kind of, exponentially increasing. Now all of a sudden, an increase is going to, if I see a similar uniform shift upward in all the states, I'm going to see a bigger shift upward in the states that were already high. And so this is a picture where we have increasing polarization, right? And alternatively, I'm not going to show you every possible iteration of this, but you can kind of do the logic, right? A downward shift is going to decrease polarization here. And imagine if this looked a little different, if this was concave instead of convex or vice versa, right? Now an increase is going to be a decrease in polarization. So already this is starting to get very complicated. We have to have the right functional form, and whether or not this thing is linear or not is going to matter a lot. And then another point that they make in their paper is maybe this is a more realistic model of what's going on. We know there's divergence between Democrats and Republicans. And so you might imagine what the real curve looks like here is that, at some point, there's actually a discontinuity. We shift from electing a Democrat to electing a Republican. And so now this becomes even more complicated because certain shifts in this, say economic inequality in states are going to cause the state to shift from being a Democratic state to a Republican state. And so in some cases, you might even have polarization is undefined here, or we're changing which states are getting counted as Republican and Democratic states. So that's pretty complicated already. And that's a point they discuss in their paper. And I think it's even more complicated than that because most likely, or a more realistic version of this is one where actually those curves look different for different states, right? So I've just drawn two, imagine one state is the dark gray here and another state is the light gray. And the light gray happens to have a Republican now and the dark gray has a Democrat now. And so, but in reality, we might, even if we could credibly estimate some average effect, there's all kinds of heterogeneity across the states that complicates this even more. And the way I happen to draw this picture illustrates that there's also some confounding here, right? The states that are higher on this dimension also have higher potential outcomes. And so that means that we're going to need some really compelling research design to even estimate the average effect. Okay, so all of this is really complicated, right? How are we going to try to take a world like this and say something about how economic inequality affects polarization overall? So their strategy is more or less as follows. So we're going to ignore all the possibilities of nonlinearity and heterogeneity, and we're going to hope that we have the right functional form. We're going to estimate the average effect of this factor of interest. And then we're going to ask, if the average effect is statistically significant, if it's substantively large, then we're going to generate predicted values of polarization in every period. And then we're going to rerun our regression without that factor of interest, do the same thing, and ask, did we predict bigger polarization in the world with our factor than without our factor? And we're going to test using random permutations whether or not our preferred model gives us better predictions than the model that doesn't have our factor, right? So that's essentially what they're doing. It makes a lot of sense in the sense that you want some way of saying, suppose you know that some measure of economic inequality matters a lot for representation, polarization is increasing over time, and you want to ask, is this inequality thing driving polarization? You need some way of empirically quantifying it. So it makes a lot of sense. Before we get too far into the details, there is a part of me that wants to ask, why are we all here? Why are we doing this? Why are we having, I'm going to get banished from future polarization conferences for having this slide up. But there's a part of me that feels like this paper was kind of written in this paper was written in the sense that all the empiricists have been measuring polarization by taking the difference in nominate between Democrats and Republicans. And they said, okay, we don't have any models about the differences in nominate between Democrats and Republicans. Let's try to figure out how we go about connecting theory and empirics. And a fear that I have is that we've kind of gone down the rabbit hole of obsessing about that measure when that measure was never the thing we really cared about per se. So let me try to flesh that out a little bit more. So why are we studying polarization? I would think we're studying polarization because we care about lots of substantive things. We care about the extent to which legislators are representing their constituents. We care about the extent to which the median legislator represents the preferences of the median voter. We care about the extent to which policy reflects the preferences of the median voter. We care about whether government is functional or not, whether the government can respond to crises, whether the government is prepared to solve new problems that arise. We care about whether or not selection and accountability are working as they're supposed to. And some of the people here might even know much more about why have we been studying polarization the way we have. I assume that we started measuring it because it's a relatively easy thing to measure, and we think it's a proxy for some of these things. Not because any of us per se think that there's some deep meaning in the average nominate difference between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate or the House. And so, one job of a theorist might be to come in and say, hey, you empiricists, you've been measuring this thing, and that's great and that's useful, but there's, what we should really be doing is thinking about how we can better measure things, or how we can better quantify things that connect with the models that we're interested in, rather than how can we force the models to fit into the thing that you guys are measuring. So that's just a different way of thinking about it. I'm just going to throw those questions out there, because there's a part of me that thinks, these models are really interesting and we can do lots of interesting things with these models. Maybe they don't fit with DW nominate and with the way we typically measure polarization. That may not be a bad thing. It might be that we should actually be measuring different things than what we're typically measuring as empiricists. And if the theorists tell us what else we should be measuring, that's an interesting conversation to have as well. So as far as specific suggestions for this paper, one would be to spend more time thinking about substantive outcomes that we care about. Are there other things we could be measuring that would be of interest other than just the average nominate difference between Democrats and Republicans? And how can we better connect the things that we're measuring empirically to the things that we care about substantively and theoretically? The other suggestion would be to at least think about these kinds of nonlinearities and the heterogeneity that I talked about, because that really matters, right? So in all of the empirical results, Dan and Asya are showing things like the log of the ratio between the district or the state median and the national mean. And then of course, the nominate is the dependent variable. And that could be right, but if that functional form isn't right, then we don't really know what to do from there. And I don't have any strong reason to think, nominate itself is some mapping of legislator ideology in some nonlinear way into something we can easily quantify. And then getting that functional, should it be the log? Should it be the ratio? Should it be something else? We should at least think about that so that we can do a better job of actually quantifying the thing that they want to quantify. And then the other, another broad point that I want to make. So I like the general procedure that they outline, although I think there might be something distracting and unnecessary there. So as a general matter, credibly estimating an average effect is different from trying to predict polarization. And you could do those things separately, right? You might have one approach for predicting polarization as usefully as you possibly can, and a different strategy for credibly estimating an average effect. You don't have to tie them together in the way that you're tying them together. What you really want is you want to estimate the effect of some factor of interest, and then you want to have some way of predicting how different would polarization look in a world in which that factor of interest hadn't changed over time. So suppose I fixed all the income inequality in all the states to whatever there was in 1970, and it didn't change over time. What would polarization look like now, right? And there are different ways of doing that, but you don't have to use the same method to do that you use to estimate the average effect of income inequality, if that makes sense. So just as an example, let me try to give a specific example of that. You might, for example, think it's a great idea when you're estimating the average effect of income inequality. You might even think, I'm going to include something like a Congress by party fixed effect in my regression. Of course, as a predictive exercise, including a Congress by party fixed effect is going to perfectly fit polarization, right? So that wouldn't be a useful exercise for predicting, because that is, that's essentially just overfitting to the answer. But it might be very useful to include a Congress party fixed effect in trying to estimate the quantity that you're interested in. So you can separate those and say, or similarly, you might have some instrument or some other kind of natural experiment that's very useful for credibly estimating the average effect that you're interested in, but is counterproductive when it comes to predicting polarization today. So there's some sense in which I think you can simplify your procedure, but maybe the proof is in the pudding, and it's going to depend a little bit on the particulars of your context, but you're going to want to have some strategy of saying, okay, I think I can say something about the effects of income inequality, and now I want to predict what polarization would be in a world in which income inequality hadn't changed since 1970. And that could just be kind of a back of the envelope kind of exercise. That could be I rerun my same regression, but with slightly different inputs. Or it could be a whole new procedure. I don't know, but it might depend on the setting. So we can come back and we can talk more about that. I have some specific suggestions. So one of the other general points that I want to make is I think it would be really interesting and even more productive if you thought more about selection and incentive effects, and even had a way of kind of studying both of them. You do this thing in the paper now where you say, let's essentially just focus on the within party effects, because those are really interesting. So to the extent that the party of your senator doesn't change, to what extent is nominate responding to changes in income inequality in the state? And that's really interesting. But the other really important thing that can happen is you can elect a different party. If things change in your state, you can change which party you're electing. And so you might even separately analyze. You might have one strategy for let's estimate the effect of income inequality on the party that we represent. And let's also separately estimate the effect of income inequality on what kind of representation we get, conditional on the party that we have. And you might even combine those two things. And I suspect that, we have lots of evidence of divergence in elections and differences between the parties within districts and within states. And so it might very well be that the selection effects are a lot bigger than the incentive effects here. And so it might very well be that that's something that you're missing, but you want to account for as best as possible. So I think that'd be really neat if you had some way of doing that together. Another general suggestion is I think it would be even more useful if you wrote the paper kind of in reverse. Right now the paper is written there's kind of a broad opening of, here's our methodological contribution and here's a general method that can be applied to all kinds of things. And then I'm going to show you a specific example that focuses on Meltzer-Richard. I think it would be more interesting to just write the substantive paper first and think about, there's this big debate about economic inequality. To what extent is economic inequality driving polarization? We're going to show you what we think is the best way of answering that question. And then in the process, we're going to give you an example for how to estimate all kinds of other things that might also be driving polarization. So it's not a huge change, but I think it would actually be easier for people to follow what you're doing. And it'd be easier for them to kind of buy into the methods as well. As you go, you'll be able to convince them with a specific example. So that's my, that's one of my last broad suggestions for you guys. But I think it's a really interesting paper. I think it's a great idea. And you're absolutely right that we currently don't have a great way of doing this. We have lots of models that are about a single election or a single district or a single state. We have lots of empirical estimates about average effects. We don't have a good way of connecting those with broad changes in polarization at the national level. And I think we need that. I think that would be a really valuable thing to have. So I think this is a really great project. And then I'm going to also briefly discuss the Shor and McCarty paper. I won't have a ton to add. I thought the presentation was really interesting. I thought the results are really interesting. They're extending all of these state legislative roll call votes back at least 20 years and more in many cases. They're putting them on a common space, which is really valuable. And there's lots of really interesting substantive results. Boris, I think, went through a lot of them already. So I won't belabor the point, but there's lots of very interesting variation across states over time. Interestingly, there's accelerating democratic extremism in just the last 10 years, which I think is something that maybe casual observers have not really noticed or talked about. And certainly that's not something I hear the New York Times writing about. So that's an interesting thing to document. And that correspondence between state opinion variance and state legislative polarization is really interesting as well. That seems like a very useful thing just to document that those two things are changing in that way. So a few requests and suggestions, mostly just requests. I think one request would be, this is fantastic. This data is really useful. We would all love to start digging into this data. We would love it if you shared the data as quickly as possible. You publish your paper and get tons of citations. The actual raw roll call voting, I think, would be useful for lots of research projects, and so that would be fantastic if this was all available. My understanding is that you're currently just estimating a fixed ideal point for each legislator, right? And I think it would also be really interesting if you estimated within legislator changes over time. I know there's different ways of doing that, and I know there's debates about what the right ways of doing that are, but I think that's also something people would be very useful in, especially for lots of designs where we might care about, for an individual legislator, how are they responding to changes in electoral incentives, changes in their electoral environment, changes in institutions, and so forth. So there are lots of designs for which the within legislator changes would be really useful. It might be even more substantive things you can do with that data. One question I have, we have these debates sometimes about which party is driving polarization. And if you look at DW Nominate in Congress, in the US House, it looks like Republicans are more responsible for the rise in polarization over the last 50 years. And it looks like maybe it's the Democrats that are more responsible in the state legislatures. And a question that I have is just how much stock should we put in those claims? So, and I guess I'd like to hear you say more about what assumptions we're making when we do that. I could imagine I could imagine an argument that given the fact that legislators might be changing over time and the agendas are changing over time, we are on stronger footing documenting the differences between the party, but we're on less strong footing when we're talking about the levels. And is one party driving the difference versus the other party? I could just imagine such an argument being made, especially if we think legislators are all shifting together in systematic ways, and it's harder to document that than it is to document the differences between legislators. So I'd be curious to hear you think about that. What assumptions have to hold for us to be able to say, yes, it is the Democrats to blame for this accelerating polarization in the last 10 years, as opposed to kind of the scale is all shifting together, and maybe it's that the Republicans are moving too. Another question I'm interested in asking is just, are there any estimates in the paper where we think there's big error bars, or are there, for example, the Republicans in Rhode Island are especially moderate. How sure are we of that? Obviously, there aren't a lot of Republican state legislators in Rhode Island, and it might be that very few of them have filled out the NPAT survey. And so, are there any things like that where there's a caveat or there's some uncertainty that we should be aware of? Presumably, that's pretty important, right? If no Republicans in Rhode Island have filled out the NPAT survey, then we might have a ton of uncertainty about what the right sort of stretch factor should be in Rhode Island and so forth. So I'd just be curious to hear about that. And then my last question / suggestion is, the value of having all this data for state legislatures means that we can answer all kinds of new questions about institutions that we couldn't before, right? So this is fantastic, and this is really useful. And it would be great to see, in this paper and in future papers, answers to all of those questions, like what are the effects of new term limits? What are the effects of campaign finance reforms? What are the effects of different redistricting schemes? There's all kinds of questions we can answer because we have all this data at state legislative level as opposed to the congressional level. That might include things like variation in the powers that party leaders have, for example. So anyway, we could go on and on, but it seems like there's a ton of new questions that we can answer with this data that we couldn't answer just with US congressional data. And obviously, there's more papers to be written. They don't have to all be in this paper, but it'd be fantastic to see a few of those, especially for some of these burning questions, questions about blanket primaries versus partisan primaries. Are any of these institutions having particularly large effects on polarization? I think all of us would be interested in those kinds of answers to those kinds of questions. So thanks for listening. I'm eager to hear more from the panelists, and I'm happy to pass it off to Kris.
Thanks, Anthony. Over to Kris Kanthak. Kris, I hope you're feeling better.
I am. Thank you. Doing much better. I think I want to start by saying there's been a lively discussion in the comments about who deserves cake. And I want to point out that Anthony offered to read 2 papers to my one. So he at least deserves a cookie, I think. Okay, so I'm mostly going to talk about Hongman's paper, and a lot of the things that I'm going to say, I think, ties to some of the other papers that we've kind of talked about, and also I think one of the things that I really want to highlight in my comments about Hongman's paper is how important and how very difficult the task is that he's set out for himself. So one of the things I'm going to do here is talk about his paper in a way that's a little bit different from the way he talks about it. And so I am skirting very close to doing that annoying discussant thing where I say you should write this other paper that's different from your paper. And hopefully I'm on I tried to stay on the fair side of that, and hopefully I succeeded. So here's one way to sort of think about Hongman's paper. And there's undergirding much of the paper, and this didn't come out much in the presentation, is this kind of older question in politics about chaos theorems and that kind of thing. And so one of the things that I kind of wanted to point out is that we know that that pundits tend to kind of think about like partisan posturing is the bad thing, and if we didn't have that, I should say pundits, present company excluded, right? So if we didn't have the parties fighting against each other, we would have this wonderful world of governance where everything worked out beautifully. And as political scientists, we know that's not true, right? We know that there's this kind of scary result that comes from the McKelvey chaos theorem, that we would get chaos and uncertainty in our political system and policies would be changing all the time. And so we don't see that, right? So one question is, why don't we see that? And one of the things that Hongman does in his paper is talking about how the parties are involved in making sure that this doesn't happen. And you may think like this is kind of a weird way to think about this paper, and maybe she's just doing that because she wanted to use this picture here in her presentation. And I'm like, okay, that's fair enough. But I actually think there might be something here, right? If we think about Hongman's paper in the following way, right? There's, the aspects of a crime, right? Means, motive, and opportunity. So Hongman's telling us the means are heresthetics, right? It's this idea that that political elites can tell us how to think about issues, and they're doing it in a way, Hongman argues, to kind of put issues on one dimension because it's better for them. Right now, why is it better? That's the motive. Things like control over the agenda and being able to speak with one voice in terms of a party that has real benefits when it comes to elections. And then the opportunity that he talks about is special rules in the House and unanimous consent agreements in the Senate. And he shows us really good evidence of this connection between the use of these special rules and low dimensionality, right? So, and I think this all makes sense. And what I want to do is kind of stretch some of these concepts a little bit, because again, keep in mind that what Hongman's trying to do is something that's really difficult, which is to talk about issues like political polarization while being very serious about representation of constituents. And it becomes really clear as you think about it for a second, and as we were just talking about, the minute you do that, the concept of representation becomes incredibly slippery, right? Because you realize that it's not, here's a unidimensional policy space and my dot's here and the guy who's representing me is here, and it's really easy, right? Because things get really complicated. So I want to dig into that. One is this kind of this concept of heresthetics, which Riker refers to as essentially thinking about what issues are about, right? What is a particular issue about? And one thing, and this is totally me, so if you think this is off track, don't blame Hongman because this is not in his paper. This is from my brain, but I've talked about this before. I think there's a really clear connection between Riker's concept of heresthetics and the old kind of converse notion of elites telling masses what goes with what, right? And I'm going to argue for a second that I actually think the converse notion is better for the story that Hongman's trying to tell than the heresthetics story, although to me, the two stories are really similar. Right. And we're seeing one of these things right now, right? How do we think about, in terms of heresthetics, one of my favorite things to ask my undergraduate students is what is it about wanting low taxes that means that you have to be pro-life? And they're always kind of blown away by this question, right? It's really difficult to answer that question. But one of the things that we know is that being pro-life goes with low taxes, right? And so how you think about the elites telling us that those two things go together is very similar to the heresthetics notion of telling us what those issues are about, right? So do we think about the abortion issue as an issue, as something about personal choice or about government overreach. And we can see, and that we're seeing it really clearly with the debate over mask mandates and COVID-19, is that there's kind of taking over of this pro-choice argument about government overreach and saying wearing masks is about government overreach. And so there are lots of people who see wearing masks as being about government overreach and abortion being about personal responsibility, right? So that's hairresthetics, but I would argue it's also Converse's notion of what goes with what. And I'm gonna come back to why I think it's better for in this context in a second, right? So motive. Hongman argues, and I think rightly, that the reason that that parties want to decrease the number of the number of dimensions is that it makes agenda control easier, right? So and it makes it easier to pass laws, and it makes it clearer what the party brand name is. I would also argue, and my dog apparently thinks this is a really dumb argument, so I'm sorry if you can hear him barking or her barking in the background. She's very judgmental. So I think also, though, that if you take this sort of the same motive and tie it even closer to elections, right? This is really the motive for trying to get down to one dimension is also specifically about winning elections and about reducing uncertainty, right? So if you let chaos take over, I don't know what the heck's going to happen in the next election. And so I have a real incentive to have there be one dimension, so I don't have chaos, right? And have it be a dimension where I win all the time, right? And so I'm not arguing that anything that's in the paper now is wrong, but I think there's by going directly, right, to the voters and thinking about the voters as being interested in something more than actually what happens on the floor of the legislature, you can make the same argument even more sharply, right? And so then the opportunity again is these special rules in the UCAs. And here's, like, I refer to them as dimension smashers without reasons, right? So literally, what special rules and unanimous consent agreements are doing is telling us what goes with what, right? They're saying, to use your example that took agriculture out of the bill, right? This issue is not about agriculture. It's only about this one thing, right? Abortion is about personal responsibility, and so is wanting to have lower taxes, right? And so I totally agree that with this argument and with the data that you show backing it up, that rules in UCAs are associated with lower dimensionality. But here's why I think Converse makes your analogy better than hairresthetics, because hairresthetics tells you how to think about issues in a way that helps out a particular elite. Where Converse, and then Zoller and others moving beyond Converse, is it takes out the reasons, right? So there's no explanation for why some things are in the bill and some things aren't, right? And this is one of the things that when I'm teaching my U.S. Congress course, I try to be very clear about. That what's germane to a bill is what the majority party says is germane to a bill. Right. And special rules in UCAs is, well, special rules more than UCAs is how that's codified. Right. And that's why I call them kind of dimension smashers without reasons, because they're smashing the dimensions, but nobody's talking about why we should think about a particular issue in a particular way. We're just saying, here are the issues that matter on this particular issue. Right. So here's where I'm kind of worried about the argument that your paper makes. Right. So in the first part, this is sort of my version of your paper. Right. Low dimensionality means that the majority party can exercise positive and negative agenda control. But it also makes it easier for parties to do that. Right. So there's this circular argument here that's very similar to kind of the argument that we used to face with respect to Rhodey's conditional party government argument, right? When you live in a world where you can use institutions like this, then you can use institutions like this, right? And so I worry that that this paper could fall into a similar problem, right? And part of that problem is, and I didn't know what to put on the slide, so I just put this. It's like kids today and their obsession with causality, and we've seen a lot of this. And it's not. I don't mean to make fun of it, because this idea of wanting to nail down causality is super important, but it is incredibly difficult with these issues when the reality is we know that they're causing each other, right? We know that it's going in a circle. And so one thing to think about in terms of trying to deal with this causality issue is to think about bringing in Mayhew in a much more, I guess, intentional manner, right? So the paper, the way the paper reads to me now, and it could be a user error, is that legislators are looking at this in terms of policy, right? They want to pass policy on the floor of the House and the Senate because they think that's going to help them win an election, right? But if we think about it as sort of more broadly in terms of being single-minded seekers of re-election first, that allows us to parse out the chicken or the egg question, right? So they're trying to put things on a single dimension because it's going to help them electorally. And so we should be unsurprised that they're putting in institutions that help them to smush everything down onto into one dimension, right? And another little piece that I was thinking about, and I've been thinking about this all day, and I don't know where it is, right? But it has something to do with this idea that, you know, we talk about polarization as it being, you know, this sort of awful evil that needs to be destroyed, but the reality is that maybe there's this kind of chaos to polarization spectrum, right? Where on the one hand, you have parties not mattering at all and institutions not really doing anything. And we're living in a McKelvey chaos world. But given that we have political elites who want to avoid doing that because they want to win elections, right? And that's the starting point. That's the chicken or the egg, is because they want to win elections. That's where we're seeing kind of this step away from chaos that keeps moving toward and generally continues to move, as we've seen from the McCarty and Shor paper, toward more and more polarization. So it could be that partisan polarization is a result of too much dimensional reduction, right? So the goal here is they're trying to reduce chaos and uncertainty. And that is, it's like, God knows what that picture is. That's a black hole. And I think that there's something like a black hole kind of happening here, that if you're reducing your dimensionality like too far, right, you're getting to the point, and this is kind of one of the things that we've talked about too as well, is the role of ideology or representation at all sort of redounds to nothing, and there is no unidimensional policy space because there's no policy space, and we're just elephants and donkeys fighting each other. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Kris. Why don't we had questions lined up from Ezra and Jeremy. Why don't we take those and then see if the paper givers want to respond to everything before we're finished. Ezra Klein, did you want to ask your question?
I do. Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me today.
Okay.
Sorry for my gigantic headphones. I can't find my AirPods. So my question was about the city polarization paper. So I guess for Boris over here. So I was reading it, and it brought to mind, I think, one of the questions I always have when I read about DW nominated scores, which is, how much are we seeing differences in views that are heavily legislatable, that are well translated into policy that comes before a legislature, and views that are not. And by that, I mean, it's pretty common observation, and it's mine too, that over the past decade, the Democratic Party has polarized on economic policy in particular, but some others as well. And the Republican Party has polarized pretty aggressively on, I would say, democracy, on certain kinds of social issues. But you have the Democrats on the one hand pushing something like the American Rescue Plan, and Republicans absolutely panicking about what's happening to Dr. Seuss books. And there is a lot more in the American Rescue Plan of the kind of thing that comes up before state legislatures than in what Dr. Seuss's nieces, grandnieces end up doing with his, 5 worst books. So I wondered, when you look at the idea that the polarization is being driven by Democrats in the states, how much you think you're seeing something stable, or you're seeing something that just simply reflects like Democrats polarizing on policy agenda issues and Republicans polarizing on a more diffuse set of cultural and, maybe small d democratic concerns?
Thank you for that question. And the peril of one of the way we do things oftentimes is that we take not a 30,000 foot view, not a 50,000 foot view, but a 300,000 foot view. And you start going so high, and you start losing some things that potentially are important. But every level has its thing, and our big picture perspective is about where the parties are relative to each other and over time and that sort of thing. And I think we bring that out in the paper, but we do lose sight of those potentially differences in substantive issues. So right now, for example, we have we're showing everything with single dimensional estimates, and Nolan and Poole and Rosenthal's research shows that at times the second dimension, which in Congress has meant race, has been really important. But mostly it's a single dimensional world. And one thing we haven't been doing here, and we should make a extra special effort of, is to see to what degree the second dimension operates here. And that's not here at all in this paper, but that's what we're going to continue working on. And in fact, it looks like the second dimension is a lot stronger in the states than it is in Congress, with the exception that we don't 100% understand what the second dimension is, and it could be different in different states in different times, right? So you might imagine, living in Illinois, it's upstate, downstate, and living in Texas, it might be urban, rural, or something like that. And so that's definitely something that we should work on. And one thing that is difficult to do is just getting the data on these bills is just so incredibly laborious. So the very first thing we do is the simplest possible thing, the lowest hanging fruit, which is get those lists of yays and nays on bills, and you throw that into the algorithm, and that gets you something useful. But I agree, there's more to be done with more specific information on the bills and so forth. So I'll stop there.
So this is a great question, and it's kind of related to something Anthony asked. So let me kill two birds with one stone. So there's actually a difference in the state and how we do the states vis-a-vis Congress, which makes this problem a little less concerning. That is the use of the candidate survey. So since we're using the candidate survey to position the space, to position legislators relative to one another, we worry a little bit less about what's being voted on in any particular state, because the survey, might ask questions about an issue it's a national issue, but not legislated on in this state at time T, but in this other state at time T+1. So that helps to kind of anchor things and keep things being driven too much by individual agenda variations across the various states. That said, I think Ezra's point can be important here, because one of the things not even the survey is picking up is some of the radicalization of the Republicans on democracy issues. I mean, it's a well-established survey. They're probably not yet asking about, stop the steal and things like that. So we may be missing some of the Republican radicalization on a certain set of issues that that only appear recently in the legislative agenda and don't appear in these surveys. It's also related to Anthony's question about how we can say things about asymmetric polarization. Typically, when we're looking at Congress, we're leveraging the overlapping generations of legislators. So we can observe asymmetric polarization by virtue of the fact that, if you have a party for which each cohort of legislators is more conservative or liberal than the preceding cohort in the party, it's pretty easy to establish that party has gotten either more conservative or liberal based on comparing the newcomers with the returners. And when we say that polarization is asymmetric at the federal level, that's essentially because that's true of the Republican Party, but not true of the Democratic Party. Most cohorts of Republicans have been more conservative than the returning cohorts, and that's not been true of the Democratic Party. So what we're finding at the states is that we're finding that it is true for Democratic parties in some states that the new members are taking much more liberal or left-wing positions than the returning cohorts. And we're on a little bit firmer ground because essentially what the survey is doing is it's positioning the party means across each state. So if we, so lots of the variation across states in terms of the means of the parties is being driven by the survey, not by the roll call votes. So anyway, a long-winded answer, but just to make the point, we're a little bit more confident about the patterns of asymmetry at the state level because we use the survey than we are at Congress. Congress, the identification problem is solved solely by the fact that the Republican pattern of more conservative newcomers has just been in place for so long that it's very transparent what's going on. It's more subtle at the states, but we're helped out by the surveys.
I'm going to actually skip over Jeremy for a moment and give Dan and Asya the chance to respond to anything that Anthony brought up. You guys have any thoughts that you want to share?
Yeah, sure. I'll hop in. As to, I guess maybe I'll hit three quick things. One, as to the sort of set of, I think, largely rhetorical questions about why study polarization for the group. In the plainest sense for our paper, we're sort of trying to meet the scholarship where it is, right? Which is the people are studying it. And so how might we connect it to models of elections? Most of the things on that list, though, were about within district representation kinds of questions. For legislative outcomes, which I think was bullet 4, for sure, polarization seems like a more proximate thing to study, or a more pertinent thing to study. But others here are probably better able to defend that. As to the last thing about the writing it as the substantive paper, it's funny. It's the Anthony Fowler in my head would never let me do that, right? Like write up a straw man paper only to have at the end this sort of like maybe payoff of just kidding. This is, if you didn't believe it, then actually the whole purpose was that it's very hard to do in the first place. And the whole thing was to be sort of to drive home how hard this is regardless of context. And to put these concerns front and center in people's minds. Like we even saw here, correlation of within district public opinion polarization to polarization at the legislature level, right? So that's exactly the kind of thing that we're sort of trying to speak to. On whether or not the test of the constituency level effect of that is the comparative static from a model of elections needs to be wed to the predicting polarization bit. We didn't sort of strongly feel as we were writing it up, which is not to say that it's by any means right, that it would need to be wed in the sense of like, if there's not this comparative static playing out at the district level, then what do we care if it happens to predict polarization, right? Like it's not actually working through the proposed mechanism. But I guess more importantly, like after we convinced ourselves that they did need to be wed as endeavors, as analytical endeavors, that we would need to sort of do the polarization part only after having taken account of anything we did in terms of identification for the model of elections part, especially if at any point we were going to put two theories jumping off from the same set of covariates in conversation with one another. And also, you know,
Can I say something about that quickly, Dan? So
yeah, please.
I probably did a bad job of explaining the concern, but the concern would be when you run your regression without your economic variable or your whatever your variable of interest is, it could be that, say, the fixed effects, like your state and your fixed effects, actually include the effect of that thing that you care about. And so you're actually like kind of biasing your results against.
But that's the whole point, right? Is that like, if we didn't include it, like Frischwah-Ewell, how do we know that it's not that covariation that was soaked up by the fixed effects is worthy for, you know, who are we to decide that no, that covariation should in fact be attributed to our thing of interest?
Well, I mean, I think an alternative you could use is run your regression of interest, and then within that regression of interest, get the predicted value of polarization in a world in which your factor of interest hadn't changed since 1970 or whatever, you know. So that's a slight tweak that doesn't have that same concern because you're not overfitting stuff with your control variables, basically.
I definitely love to ask more questions about it. It feels like it's soaked up by any fixed effects, but I am interested.
We're over time by a couple minutes. Hongman, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share?
No, actually, thank you very much for your suggestions and the emphasis on re-election motivation and going into the re-election part first. I'm going to consider that as a revising point for the paper. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hongman. Asya, do you have anything in like a minute or two that you wanted to add to Dan?
That's okay. I'll just thank Anthony for those wonderful comments.
Okay, thanks very much. And Jeremy, we didn't have time to get to you, and unfortunately, but we're going to reconvene in now 6 minutes for the final part of the symposium, the Ezra Klein panel. And we'll see if anyone on the panel can offer any suggestions or arguments that are quote unquote better than Ezra. Right? I told my administrators that I would add that.